Hello, welcome to today's edition of the Academy. Today we're going to dive into Chapter 10 of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Now, we're only going to cover the first 5 sentences. This chapter is about terrain and how to handle, how to deal with it, and what its effects and implications are with your army. Okay, so we're going to start with breaking this first section of the chapter up into 2 or 3 separate videos where Sun Tzu talks about 6 different types of terrain. Okay, I'm going to try to narrow in on each of these, zero in and try to unpack what he's trying to say. So, let's just dive in, chapter sentences 1 through 5. Sun Tzu said, "We may distinguish 6 kinds of terrain, to wit, accessible ground, 1, 2, entangling ground, 3, temporizing ground, 4, narrow passes, 5, precipitous heights, and 6, positions at a great distance from the enemy. Ground which can be freely traversed by both sides is called accessible. With regard to ground of this nature, be before the enemy in occupying the raised and sunny spots. Carefully guard your lines of supply. Then you will be able to fight with advantage. Ground which is abandoned but is hard to reoccupy is called entangling. From this position, if the enemy is unprepared, you may sally forth and defeat him. But if the enemy is prepared for your coming, and you fail to defeat him, return being impossible, disaster will come." Okay, so we're only covering the first 2 terrain types in here. Now, when we talk about terrain types, we need to avoid thinking about the specific terrain pieces you would put on the board. We want to look more at the nature of the terrain on the tabletop. A forest has rules in various games, but so do rocky outcroppings, so do water features, what have you. They'll have different rules and different things happen, but we're often tempted to look at those rules and try to match it up to these concepts. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to look at that narrow of a window at this. We want to look broader. Everything he's talking about here takes, in a game turn or a game sense, several turns to hash out. Here we're talking about moving freely. Well, we're not talking about moving the few inches per turn that your infantry models or vehicles can move. We're talking about moving over the course of several turns, freely or not, right? So let's look at accessible ground. When you look at a table, you're going to look for the areas where there's no penalties or disadvantage to movement. In fact, you also want to look for areas where there's advantages. Some game systems utilize special rules for roads, whereby you have a movement bonus and you can move more quickly along a road. You want to look for these, not specific, small 6-inch by 6-inch areas, but across the tabletop. How much area of the table is open and accessible, will allow you to freely move and maybe even secure advantageous positions, such as around an elevated segment of the table, in open ground but still elevated, giving you good lines of sight. Moving on and off of that hill is very easy. You won't be hung up by a sudden shift in the battle and be slow to retreat or move off of it because the ground is open, right? So freedom of movement is what this is all about. Look for areas and make sure that as you deploy your forces and you move those, that you're aware of those areas of freedom of movement, so that when you need to, you can quickly take advantage of those and move through the next phases of the battle. Now, the second one, the second aspect of this accessible is look in your deployment zone. Often we focus on the types of terrain in our deployment zone. Where can I hide my units? The problem with that is we end up kind of getting ourselves trapped in a corner sometimes. I don't mean corner of the table. I mean a particular unit might be caught in a terrain structure and not able to actually execute much of the plan. Look at how you can utilize the open, accessible areas of your deployment zone to rapidly shift units, left, right, center, whatever, in response to what your opponent does in his deployment or his initial turns. So think in terms of accessible ground in your deployment zone, how can you use it to position units so that you can freely adjust and shift? Okay, if you've got a large piece of terrain in the middle of that deployment zone that pretty much cuts your deployment zone in half, you have to realize that will prevent you from freely moving, reinforcing one flank to the left, to the next, right? So that's what you're trying to avoid, what you're trying to look for in terms of accessible terrain. Now, in the case of entangling terrain, this is kind of hard to picture, but I'll use one example that I can think of off the top of my head. Entangling is defined by Sun Tzu as terrain that is easily abandoned, but hard to reoccupy. Now again, we're not looking at like the forest or the rocky area, which may slow your infantry movement down. We're talking longer term. Getting your unit into position once it's left that position. Think in terms of ruins or buildings where you've got multiple levels. Your opponent is half a board away, and if they're not prepared for your assault, now when I mean assault, I mean throwing shots downfield at them, not necessarily close combat, you can easily leave that ruin or building, get down and out into the streets, moving into firing position, or even shifting within the ruins to get shots down, closing in. Sometimes you have to close the distance in order to actually get those shots, quality shots, especially if you're going into side armor, trying to maneuver to get side armor. You may have to abandon those nice positions in the building where you're secure. The problem is it takes longer to get back into that building and get the unit back into position where it was so it can effectively cover its area of responsibility. So that would be a good example, because what happens is when the opponent is not prepared for you to assault them, attack them with that unit, you can go out and go in, do damage, mess it up. If you start to realize you're not doing the effect you wanted, you can pull them back, and you should have enough time to retake your position. But if the opponent's ready to counter it and you don't do the damage you need to initially, you're not going to be able to retake that terrain quick enough. Your opponent can move in much more quickly because the open street's outside, for example, and bring in attacks that can devastate you, especially flamethrowers and the like that can really decimate anything in cover. Okay, so think in terms of entangling. It's easy to get out of certain terrain elements, harder to get back into them. And that's what he's cautioning us against. When you're in that position, it's always a good place to be, but be careful about abandoning it. Abandon it only when you know you can retake it rapidly, and not put yourself in a position where if things fall apart, your unit's going to struggle to get back into cover, into that area, and basically preserve themselves from the onslaught to come, okay, as your opponent counterattacks. All right, so those are the first two types. Next week we'll cover a couple more different types, and we'll just slowly work our way through. All right, hope that kind of made some sense. I know it's a short video this week, but it's a good start into this chapter. And again, I don't want to overwhelm with all these details because there's some thinking that needs to happen here. So if you find it useful, comment below, share, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you in next week's edition of the Academy. Bye-bye.